Hello, and welcome back to Ask a News Worker. Where does news come from? Where do babies come from? That's a different channel. But for the purposes of this channel, we're going to get into where news comes from. I got into this in other videos in some respect, talked about news conferences being the source of many news stories, but not all news stories, how a lot of things that take place at a news conference don't actually go on to become news because reporters and editors decide that certain content wasn't worth turning into a news item. I talked about social media, Twitter in particular, being the source of many news items. Reporters, editors, journalists, news outlets will scour Twitter and turn something into a story. Increasingly, Twitter spats, Twitter feuds will become news stories. It's been like that for a while, but it's just becoming a beat unto itself. A beat is a term, I don't know how widely known or understood that is. A beat is a journalistic term for a repeated source of stories. That's one way to define it. So if someone is on the crime beat in their city or in their area, that means that they're repeatedly writing about crime issues. If they're on a food beat, they're repeatedly reading about food. That's where the term comes from. So there's a lot of different reporters and editors out there on different beats, a lot of different outlets covering different beats, and sometimes stories that could fit into that beat won't make it into the news because the people decided it wasn't interesting enough to them, or they doubted whether the audience would really care that much. Sometimes it's a personal preference thing, and sometimes it's I'm not sure the audience cares about this, or it's that they don't want to give it any more attention than it's already gotten. So social media, one source of the news. Press conferences, one source of the news. Every news item has a source. That's one very important thing to keep in mind. Everything has a source. So if the leader of a country comes out and talks at a press conference and that becomes news, the source of that news was the press conference hosted by or featuring the politician that is making the headlines, making the news. If a story is on something that happened on Twitter, the source is the tweets. When Donald Trump was U.S. president, a lot of his individual tweets became entire news stories. Not all of them did, but a lot of them did. So the source of the story was the tweet. In other cases, the source of the news might be a study, or it might be an interview with someone. A study being something published by a university, by a think tank, that becomes the basis of news there. But it all has a source. That's the most crucial thing to keep in mind, is that everything in the news, at least should, have a source. Sometimes things are in the news and it's not clear who the source is, what the source is. Sometimes outlets protect their sources for good reason in many cases. Sometimes they may not have that legit of a source, but they're trying to make it seem like they do. This is how differences between news outlets play out. The more professional ones are always basing their stories, especially their high-profile stories, on a real legitimate source, and ones that are not so reputable, it's not clear where they're getting it from. It just might be something they felt like running because they thought it was interesting. And this is why we all have to be careful, skeptical, scrutinizing, because it's not clear what the source of every news item is sometimes. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So where does the news come from? It comes from various sources. Again, it can be a document, it can be a tweet, it can be a statement, it can be a press conference, it can be someone who said something on the street to a person holding a microphone. There's all different sources playing into the media sphere, and some are more substantial than others, some are more legitimate than others, but all news tends to have a source, has to have come from somewhere. If it doesn't have a source, then it was just made up, and that's not good. That just means that somebody felt like putting something in the news because they thought it'd be cool to put it in there. I'm not going to say that never happens. It certainly does. The more reputable outlets don't do that. They base everything they publish on a real source. But again, not every media outlet is reputable. We'll get into other videos about how to tell if an outlet is reputable or not, what makes a reputable outlet. That'll be a future video. But for the purposes of this one, where does news come from? It comes from a variety of sources that are decided upon by people who work in the news business. Again, as I've said in other videos, what makes something news is a news worker like myself or someone else deciding that it's news. There's a lot of things being pushed into the public domain every day. There's a lot of things happening in the world, but not all of it becomes news because many people in the news business decide that it's not worth writing about or publishing about. So the news is very explicitly a human creation. It's a human-made industry. It's becoming more and more robotic, quite literally through things like AI. I don't know if AI software counts as robots per se, but it's becoming more computerized, I suppose. There are news stories being generated by software based on a few inputs. Examples I've seen are like sporting events. So two teams play a game and there's certain variables like the final score, the amount of strikeouts if it was a baseball game, something like that. And a computer can just make a very simple, natural sort of seeming news story from that data. So that's happening. But for the most part, the news that gets published in any given day has been presided over, or at least monitored, interfered with, toyed with, tinkered with by human beings. And again, human beings decide what is news and what is not. As of mid-2022, that is still the case. And the sources can come from many different places. Again, press conferences, social media events, real-life events, documents, studies. A source who wants to break a story through a journalist that they trust. You know, there have been many famous cases throughout media history where someone had some very specific secret information that they wanted to get out there. They go to a journalist. They ask them to publish their story. The journalist hopefully vets them first and makes sure that everything is correct and accurate. Reputations rest upon that sort of thing. But even then, there's a source. There's always a source. So as a news consumer, I would always ask the question when you're consuming the news, what is the source? Where did this come from? What is this based on? How did this come to be? What is the root source? What is the foundation of the news item that I am consuming right now? Where did it come from? Who presided over it? Who sort of ushered it into the world as news? A lot of stuff happens, but not all of it becomes news. Police stations, for example, will put out statements all day. Various police forces will put out statements on things that are happening. Sometimes it becomes news, sometimes it doesn't. It's not always clear why some news editors decide to make something a news story and why they leave other stuff behind. But again, there is discretion. They are being judicious. And it will depend on the individual, depending on the organization, might even depend on the timing. Again, it's a human business. It's human beings deciding every day what the news will be, what to write about, what to publish, and what sources that news will be based on. So where does news come from? Many different sources, hopefully legitimate ones. Unfortunately, not always. We'll get into more detail in future videos, but I just wanted to get the conversation started, the thought started. Where does news come from? Ask yourself that. Next time you're looking at the news, say, where did this come from? Can I identify the source in the very news I'm reading? Is it obvious? Sometimes it'll say sources say. Who are those sources? Might not be disclosed. Maybe for good reason, maybe not. But it all comes from a source. So just keep that in mind as we continue to discuss the news here on Ask a News Worker. Thanks again for watching.